The efficacy of talk therapy for PTSD is on the order of about 30%. 30%! I think that's appalling. If I knew in my 20s that talk therapy had an efficacy of 30%, if I had an informed consent process, I don't think I would have done it.
Dr. Sara Gottfried, so great to be with you once again.
My pleasure. Happy to be here.
And we are about to embark on a number of really interesting episodes, really centered around your new book, your sixth book, believe it or not, called The Autoimmune Cure. And we're going to be talking about psychedelic-assisted therapy, about autoimmune disease, around trauma, around all sorts of other kinds of modalities and praxis. And I'm just can't wait to get into it. Perhaps you can talk about that in relation to stress response. Like what represents a healthy versus an unhealthy or maladaptive stress response?
With stress response, there's a few different factors that I think about. And I always think in terms of measuring first, because I think that's a way of creating specificity around it. So when the stress response was first studied, and I joke sometimes that it feels like to me that Harvard Medical School takes credit for pretty much everything, whether they were the first or not, but Walter Cannon at Harvard in the 30s studied the stress response. And he's the one who coined the phrase sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight. And in the autonomic nervous system, kind of the way that you respond to stress automatically, you've got the sympathetic nervous system, kind of the on button for stress. And then you've got the parasympathetic nervous system, kind of the off button, which I now think of more as stay and play. I used to think of it as rest and digest, but that didn't capture me quite as much as stay and play. And that stress response is really designed anciently to be triggered not that frequently. Maybe like once a month, once a quarter, you're dealing with some sort of predator on the savannah. So you activate your sympathetic nervous system, you have a release of adrenaline, your cortisol rises, and you've got, as a result of those hormonal triggers, you've got this ability to, you raise your blood sugar, and that's one of the effects of cortisol. And so your muscles can soak up that glucose and use it to fight or to flee, run. And what's happened is that we're now exposed to that stress response much more often. It might be an email that you get in the morning. It might be the food that you're eating. It might be, there's so many ways that our stress response system can become overburdened and triggered too often. So how do you look at that? Well, you can look at it by measuring some of these biomarkers. You can look at cortisol. So pretty much every patient I see, every client I take care of, I'm going to do a 4 or 5 point cortisol. I'm going to look at their cortisol awakening response. What happens to cortisol when they first wake up in the morning? 30 minutes later, 60 minutes later, I'll look in the saliva. And then I'll look at it throughout the day, because that's such a critical biomarker, an indicator, signal of what is happening with the stress response. There's other things you can measure too, such as heart rate variability. So that time between each of your heartbeats, which, your heart's not like a metronome. When you've got 60 beats per minute, it's not beating every second. It's 0.88 seconds, then 1.12. So it varies, and that variation is a measure of the balance between the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. And then there's another layer of homeostasis in the stress response and what works for those who are assigned male at birth and those that are assigned female at birth, because that initial research by Walter Cannon was done on men and assumed to apply to women. And women have some nuances and differences in the way that they respond to stress. First, we know from the American Psychological Association that women experience more stress. They may or may not have more stress, but they perceive more stress,
Mhm.
about 10% more than men. They experience more trauma. They've got more sexual trauma, especially as children. And women, not just, when you look at this fight or flight response, women do other things that may be less functional in terms of being faced with a big stressor and then being able to resolve that stress response.
Right.
So women I think of more as fight, flight, freeze, fawn.
Mhm.
And the freeze response, just kind of like feeling like, oh my God, deer in headlights. Or the fawn response, let me people please. Let me kind of solve this problem. Let me make things better for you in your environment. Those things tend to lead to a stress response that doesn't complete.
Mhm.
It lives on in the body. There's a signature of that stress that continues in your system. And we tend to see that more in women than we do with men. And then Shelley Taylor at UCLA also found that women do better in terms of resolving the stress response if they tend to befriend. So that's
Mhm.
like a whole other piece of oxytocin and how that changes the hormonal milieu that we're talking about. So, getting back to homeostasis, what I think is hopeful here, and what I've certainly seen in my clients and also in myself, is that your dynamic range, kind of your ability to roll with what's coming your way from the external environment, that can change. Like you can train yourself to have a wider dynamic range,
Mhm.
to be able to roll with the punches, with more punches. And so that's the empowering message here, that you can change your
Yeah.
stress response.
Yeah. Yeah. Skylar encourages me to quote unquote eat some dirt. And this should not, it's psychologically basically, but she's also creating a metaphor there. And of course, this is not to justify, insult or odious behavior or neglect, etc. But it's also, there is some wisdom in the application of Stoic principles, for example, in building one's own psychological immune system. So, in your book, you talk a little bit about the hygiene hypothesis and how, in certain Western cultures that are addicted to antibacterial soaps and things like that, essentially we have not been able to properly build our immune systems, because immune systems from a very, very young age are built through exposure to low grade pathogens, which over time, you know, through B cell memory, et cetera, like that the body learns and then remembers, at least the immune system, which is fascinating. Um, what is self and what isn't self until it doesn't, and we'll get there. um, and um, and in the same way, if you are able to build your psychological immune system through low grade exposure to pathogenic thoughts or pathogenic insult or social media or the purposeful leveraging of your own negativity bias by YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, fill in the blank, um, then you can solve for this evolutionary mismatch that you just so articulately described. Essentially, this notion that we're always getting chased by the saber-toothed tiger, such that this endocrine cascade is always happening. And maybe you could actually take a moment to describe how, like, for example, chronically elevated cortisol levels might present f- metabolically, like in the gut, in the immune system. And then, because that way we can truly understand how our reaction or response to stress or trauma actually shows up in our physiology.
Yeah, and cortisol is a good one because most people can relate to, the most common stress hormone that we're looking at. So, Yes. What happens, for people who are in a state of homeostasis, and I've got a few patients like this, maybe a dozen, they are exposed to a stressor and they raise their cortisol in response. Their blood sugar goes up a little bit and then they return to homeostasis. They return to a state of balance. They don't have kind of this dysregulated cortisol signal that persists. And then the other, 30,000 patients that I've taken care of, there's a level of dysregulation. So what I found when I first measured my cortisol, I was in my 30s. I had had one kid and I was experiencing symptoms that could map to high cortisol. So I had a lot of belly fat that I couldn't lose. I had this baby weight that just was entrenched. I had PMS, premenstrual syndrome. I had no sex drive. I was working in medicine at the time. So I was working, long days, like 12-hour days, seeing about 30 to 40 patients a day. But I went to my doctor and I had my list of woes. And he suggested a birth control pill and to go on a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. And I just got so angry in that moment when he was suggesting these things. And for my belly fat, he said, "You know this. It's simple math, Sarah. Like, eat more and eat
Calories in,
less and
calories out.
exercise more,
Yeah.
and that'll help you with your belly fat." So I left his office angry and I went to the lab and ran a hormone panel. And my cortisol was so high. It was about 3 times what it should be in my blood, total cortisol. So that was leading to moodiness. There's some debate about this idea of pregnenolone steal, but there's this idea that if you're making so much cortisol in your system, you may not be making some of the other sex hormones like DHEA and testosterone. Maybe that's one of the reasons why my libido was lower. Wasn't making as much progesterone, so I had a harder time soothing myself. So when you look at the data on high cortisol levels, there's a pattern that emerges. And I wrote about this in my first book. There's metabolic dysfunction because cortisol's got a number of jobs in the body. It raises blood sugar, it modulates your immune system, and it also raises your blood pressure. So my high cortisol was associated with these mood changes. It's a wear and tear hormone, so it breaks down muscle. Some of the precursors to the signal that raises cortisol, like corticotropin releasing hormone, directly increases intestinal permeability. So it leads to so-called leaky gut and more food reactions and more inflammation because 70% of your immune system is in your gut. And so it's getting triggered by these things that are passing through the tight junctions. Psychiatrists use cortisol as a suicide marker. About 50% of people with depression have high cortisol levels. And it's a little hard to know what's the chicken and what's the egg, like which came first, but cortisol is when it's dysregulated. When you're not in homeostasis, cortisol is like a bully. And it's not a democracy. Like cortisol is, because it's so primary and it's so involved in life, in your daily function. Like you can do without estrogen, you can do without testosterone. Life is better with them for sure, but you can't live without cortisol. And so it's not a democracy. It is a dictatorship, and not a benevolent dictatorship when you're out of homeostasis.
Yeah. Right. And then as it pertains to like sleep wake cycle or your circadian rhythm, it's also on this teeter totter with melatonin, for example. And there's a moment at which not a moment, but there's a time of day at which melatonin would naturally secrete if properly stimulated early in the day. Some of that has to do with exposure to blue light, etc. But the disruption and the dysregulation of cortisol can spill over into this disrupted sleep patterns. I can raise my hand and volunteer for that study.
Right.
um, and then we know all the knock-on impacts. I mean, of disrupted sleep, from lack of memory consolidation and learning, and insulin sensitivity, or really the building of insulin resistance. I mean, it seems like I've read things that like even one night of bad sleep might result in insulin resistance. Um, failure to activate like the lymphatic system, like the kind of cleaning out of dysfunctional proteins in your brain at night, and then just general like infirmities of one's own direct experience, like being crabby and eating comfort foods, and all the things that you might do, or over caffeinating if you're not getting enough sleep. So the kind of failure of homeostasis around cortisol seems to be kind of in stark relief. It's at the front of the line in terms of primacy, of things that we can focus on. Um,
It's at the front of the line, but I would also say, let's take a wider view.
mhm,
So, when you think about the stress response system, I think it's helpful to think about, okay, what are the parts of the body, the systems of the body that are the most vulnerable?
mm,
And so we've talked about some of them, but I like to put them together as the PINE network.
yeah.
So, PINE, Psychoimmunoneuroendocrine Network. And these are the parts of the body that are the most vulnerable to toxic stress, to a loss of homeostasis. So, yes, cortisol in some ways is the most intuitive. So, that's the E of PINE, and that's your endocrine system. Cortisol also affects other hormones, such
Mm.
as the ones we talked about: estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, oxytocin. But you can't forget about the immune system.
That's right.
Especially nowadays, there's less conversation about it, there's less specificity. It's in some ways it's a more complex system to really wrap your head around. And then you also can't forget about the nervous system and sort of the
Hmm.
way, heart rate variability is one measure of that, but just in thinking in terms of your vagus nerve and what you do to improve vagal tone. And then P, your psychology. So I want people to not just pay attention to cortisol at the front of the line. It's a good one to focus on,
Hmm.
but we want to think about this whole network.
Mm. So I think this is a good moment to help people understand trauma and the nature of trauma, um, and go upstream for a moment of what is the provenance of a lot of this stress. And then we can go downstream and see how that can manifest in this panoply of presentations that we've sort of put under this rubric of autoimmunity. So let's go upstream for a second. Um, how do you understand trauma, and are there different ways to understand it?
First, I want to say that trauma was not a big part of my medical education and training.
Hmm.
It was, I would say, trauma and nutrition were sadly lacking. And I really didn't think about it. I didn't I didn't look for it in my patients and clients until the past 5 to 10 years. So, the way I think of trauma, we've got so many folks that have defined it beautifully for us, like Gabor Mate and Bessel van der Kolk. And what I've learned from Gabor Mate is that it's not so much what happened to you, although we want to know about that and we want to know the details. It's the way that the dysregulation lives on in your body.
Hmm.
So it's the way that toxic stress, the way that it becomes embedded, biologically embedded, and lives on in your system. And the focus so much, especially with psychiatrists or people um, who work on psychology and the mind, is the psychological consequences of trauma. So
Mhm.
the post-traumatic stress disorder, the depression, anxiety, disordered eating, obsessive compulsive disorder, attention deficit disorder. So we tend to focus on the psychology of it.
Right.
And what I'm really interested in is the biological ramifications.
Right.
So the way that biological embedding might affect your blood sugar, might affect your difficulty with sleeping, might affect your relationships, might affect your ability to accomplish your mission. So I like to focus on the entire perspective, especially those biological pieces that we can objectively measure and we can work to improve.
Right. Yeah. There are many, I think, very cogent definitions, and Peter Levine uses the tyranny of the past, which I've uh, co-opted and try to give him credit wherever I can. Um, but indeed, I think the good news here is that it is not the event itself; it is the valence and salience emotionally that we assign, to that event going forward. So, you can't really go back to the past and change the underlying event, but you can have some agency over your continued response to that event, right?
That's right. And I think of this particular piece as stuckness.
Hmm.
So, are you someone who had a traumatic event and you were able to process it? Maybe maybe you were surrounded by people who helped you sort it through, whether you were a child or, a survivor or adult survivor of 9/11. Or were you someone who was more solitary and kind of left alone with this difficult, overwhelming event that occurred?
Hmm.
So there's a stuckness that I think is important. And some people, despite their best efforts, they spend decades in talk therapy and still feel stuck.
Yeah.
And we're just starting to understand why that is.
Why? Yeah. Why is the standard of care there seem to be not completely acceptable?
Well, the standard of care, I would say, misses the mark.
Yeah.
So, the standard of care for if you take a diagnosis like post traumatic stress disorder, if you look at the military system and what the Veterans Administration does to deal with PTSD, the standard of care is that someone with PTSD is sent to therapy with or without selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And there's 3 that are FDA approved for post traumatic stress disorder. When I was looking at the data associated with this, the outcome studies that we have, the efficacy of talk therapy for PTSD is on the order of about 30%.
Mm.
30%. Even when you add a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor with or without therapy, the efficacy is still about 30%. I think that's appalling. I've got a pretty high ACE score. If I knew in my 20s that talk therapy had an efficacy of 30%, if I had an informed consent
Right.
process, I don't think I would have done it. Like I spent so many hours and so many thousands of dollars for a pretty low efficacy. And part of why this is important is because it's led to the rise of more trauma informed care. It's led to the rise of interventions like EMDR, Peter Levine,
Mm.
somatic experiencing, more embodiment practices like Bessel van der Kolk talks about in The Body Keeps the Score. And it's also led to a reimagining of psychedelic assisted therapy, which has an efficacy in post traumatic stress disorder that's about double the
Hmm.
standard of care.
Mm.
That's really exciting.
Yeah. That's huge. It's really the biggest development in perhaps multiple generations in terms of care. Definitely want to get there. I want to just hover over trauma for just another moment, because I think most people associate trauma with like a very severe acute event. And it can be an incident that involves, sexual assault or rape or racism or very severe neglect. Um, but is there a form of small t chronic trauma that seems to produce the same detrimental knock-on impacts?
Well, this relates to the idea that it's not so much what happened to you, it's the level of dysregulation
Hmm.
that is in your system as a result
Mm,
of the event.
right.
So, yes, there are the capital T traumas that most people would agree are traumatic, like the Holocaust, a genocide, um, surviving 9/11, a near fatal car crash. And then there's these small t traumas that can either individually or in aggregate overwhelm the stress response. And that could be things that are more like, you know, um, misattunement,
Hmm.
a breakup with someone that you love, conflict in your marriage. Um, you know, so yes, both are important. And, what's as I was looking at the data, one of the things that I found so interesting is that whether it's a big T trauma or a small t trauma, there's so much bioindividuality
Yeah.
in terms of the response to it. And we can make some statements about that. I mean, even if you look at those that are assigned male at birth, those that are assigned women, female at birth, when they are exposed to the same trauma, women often have higher rates of post-traumatic stress disorder.
Right.
So there's a lot of moving parts here, but I think it's important to realize, some folks say to me when I'm asking them about adverse childhood experiences or what kind of toxic stress they've got in their life, they'll say, "Oh, I don't have trauma. I had a happy childhood." And then when you get into the details and you actually ask them to fill out an ACE questionnaire, it turns out, oh, pretty much all of us have had a traumatic load.
Mm. So, for people who aren't aware of it, what is the ACE questionnaire?
The ACE questionnaire stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. So we've got a link on our website to do the questionnaire, which is in the public domain. You can also Google it. And it started out as a 10-point questionnaire looking at things like physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect,
Yeah. More
um,
capital T stuff. That was at least how I interpreted it.
capital T, although some people would say neglect, there's a spectrum of neglect.
True.
Um, having a parent that went to prison, having a parent or caregiver who had an addictive process, um, having parents who divorced.
Yeah. That was one box I checked.
Me too.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I scored fairly low on the more traditional 10 question ACE. I was a 2. Um, and, maybe I can share with you one of my traumatic childhood experiences that I've been able to recognize, but I haven't been able to fully treat. Um, but maybe before that, do you mind sharing where you were on the
Mhm.
ACE? Yeah.
Well, two is still elevated. So it does increase your risk of a number of chronic diseases, including prediabetes and the development of metabolic dysfunction.
Hmm.
What we know based on the original study that was done by the Centers for Disease Control and Kaiser Permanente is that when you look at middle aged people, so 40 to 65, and you ask them about the ACE questionnaire and what happened before they were 18, having a score of 1 or higher is associated with about 45 different chronic diseases in middle age.
Hmm.
So that was the first study to show this association.
So
And
let me just drill into that. So if you just even check one box out of the 10, you have a much greater predisposition for the development of like 45 different diseases. And these,
You have
yeah,
a significant increased risk
uh-huh.
of, I don't know if it's all 45, but certainly for some of the bigger ones. And my score is 6. So I've got a pretty high ACE score. So, this is not one of those tests that you want a high score on. It's out of 10, the
Yeah,
original study. I also use the Institute for Functional Medicine, which has a different denominator.
right.
But for, an ACE score of 6 puts me at risk of pretty much all of those chronic diseases. And they range
Mhm.
from cardiovascular disease to diabetes to autoimmune disease to depression, alcohol use disorder. There's a long list. And it's important to know this because a lot of people don't connect the dots and they've got trauma that lives on in their system that might be, taking them on this journey toward a chronic disease. And they don't realize that it's within their power to potentially resolve that trauma, resolve that biological embedding, and reduce their risk of
Mhm.
chronic disease.
Yeah, I mean, it's not as simple as drawing a straight line from like these 6 that I checked to this disease, though one can certainly find the physiological causes or chains of events that do lead there. In your life, in your case, how were you able to connect, these your score of 6 to, some of your infirmities?
Well, going back to that experience I had in my 30s,
Yeah.
I had a cortisol that was 3 times what it should be. And I am sure that is related to some of the trauma that I experienced. And it's not just childhood trauma. I chose a career that is traumatizing.
Yeah.
I chose a career where you're dealing with life or death on a daily basis, and you're often dealing with it on no sleep and no food. And, um, you know, I'll invoke Gabor Mate here. He talks about how medicine selects for people who are traumatized because it's like a cult.
Mhm.
You join this group, they cut you off from your family, you wear a weird outfit, scrubs, um you're not allowed to eat when you want to, you can't go to the bathroom when you want to. I'm not complaining, I'm not saying, I'm a victim here, but medicine selects for
Mhm.
people who are traumatized.
Thank God they have these really nice fitted scrubs now. Have you seen the
They've gotten better.
They've
They've
gotten
gotten
better.
better for
I was like,
sure.
I might adopt some scrubs.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they're like
Uh,
cozy.
um, well, so I'll share with you briefly this experience that I had when I was in 7th grade. And maybe you can help me unpack it because I can cognitively put my thumb on it, but I can't seem to exercise it,
Mm,
if you will.
yes.
So, um, I had a group of friends, boyfriends who, I mean, boys have a very strange way of demonstrating their affection for one another. I have 3 girls. They can be catty, but generally sweet. But yeah, I was walking down with my guys this one particular hallway at South School in Canaan, Connecticut. And we were like flicking each other's ears and giving each other what's when you step on the back of someone's shoe, like a flat
Flat
tire,
tire.
right?
Yes.
And this was just like very commonplace between boys who like each other. It's like, I like you, I'm gonna flick your ear
Yeah.
lobe.
Let me hurt you a
Let me
little.
hurt you. And unfortunately, in my case, that phenomena sort of spiraled a little out of control and they pushed me into a locker. And this is a kind of very, very narrow, typical school locker, and then closed and shut the door on it.
Mm.
And I mean, I'm still kind of unaware of how much time I spent in there. It felt obviously like a lifetime.
Yeah.
could have been only 90 seconds. But as you can imagine, I went into complete amygdala hijack and, screaming, pounding. And in retrospect, as I've tried to unpack it, I realized that my reaction probably inhibited them from letting me out
Mm.
because they were so petrified or scared or shocked themselves by my reaction. But it was, as intense of a sympathetic experience as I've ever had. And then, they finally did let me out, and I came out like a whirling dervish and sort of like a, fire hose of like snot and saliva, and, just like
Yes.
swinging at anything, anyone,
Yeah.
um, and then kind of, collapsing, on the ground. And of course, at this juncture, there's a significant assembly of kids, girls, other boys to impress or embarrass yourself in front of. And then, so there was that acute experience. And then there was kind of the shame that, for the rest of the year, I was like, that guy that got stuck in that got locked in the
Mm.
locker, you know, that was like the whisper. Um, and the way that carries forward, at least in my very, very non-clinical assessment of it, is that, yeah, I am hyper claustrophobic. I don't like, I will not get on an airplane if I'm in the middle seat.
Mhm.
I just won't get on, you know,
Mhm.
like, sorry, I'll fly later. But just being on an airplane, being in, a steel tube, 40,000 feet in the sky, doesn't tickle my fancy. I will do it, but it is I have to work myself up to it. But it goes beyond just sort of elevators and, tight spaces. It goes into any situation uh, that I cannot extricate myself from.
Mhm.
So there is a lack of control and a lack of power, and it shows up physically in severe acute nausea.
Mm.
And it's still all the time. I mean, even with like podcasts, I'm pretty comfortable here, it's my own house. But like, I, oftentimes, like I'll see a little hint of that.
Mm.
And then certainly in more, you know, bigger situations where like a high pressure meeting inside of a small office, oof, that is like paroxysms of nausea and anxiety. So I can recognize it, but here I am, with almost every tool in the toolkit, but
Right.
I haven't been able to tame the wild beast of the physiological symptoms.
First, thank you for sharing the story. It sounds, I feel like I was back there with you. That experience of being in seventh grade and the being shoved into a locker. It's if you what I feel as you describe it, just feel so much compassion and love for seventh grader Jeff. And there's a way that you were forced to freeze. You were forced by being stuck in this locker not to be able to fight. So
Hmm.
for whatever period of time, you were frozen in this helpless situation without agency. And that is terrifying. That is a terrifying situation in terms of stress response.
Hmm.
And then you superimpose on that being a seventh grader. So you were probably 13, something like that,
12, yeah, something like
12,
that.
13. And this is right at the time where this hormonal symphony is starting. So you've got more testosterone. You've got, kind of this development of community, kinship, connection with other people, like that becomes increasingly important right at the time of puberty. So in some ways, it sounds like a perfect storm and a traumatic situation that still, as you described, kind of lives on in your body and has these after effects, the nausea that you described and that sense of, never again wanting to be put in a situation where you have that feeling of helplessness.
Mhm.
And then the shame response, as you said, you finally got out of the locker, you had girls around, you had other kids who witnessed this. And in some ways, that kind of re traumatizes the entire experience
Mhm.
because shame does that. It's, I really want to thank you for sharing it because, people look to you, they look at what you've built with your media empire. They look at, the way that you live your life, the way that you bring so much consciousness and so many rituals and practices. And, you wear a continuous glucose monitor and you had your sauna and your cold shower. Like you
Right.
do all the
I pay
things.
my taxes.
You pay your taxes.
Raise my children.
And yet these are things that take us back to that moment, that incredibly vulnerable moment.
Mm.
And I want to talk about hope for a moment
Mhm.
because what I've seen, I just got, I finished 3 certifications in psychedelic assisted treatment. And so I've really seen people who are able to take a memory like this and walk through it with a different response. And they're able to kind of complete that feeling of terror and that feeling of helplessness. They're able to move through it and resolve it. And I also, this is a little more edgy. I feel like there's a way that some of our experiences, like my A score of 6, maybe you get to decide, maybe this experience you had as a 7th grader, there was something about that experience that compelled me to develop a capacity to be seen and heard authentically for who I am.
Mhm.
And to have a sensitivity and an awareness of other people who've gone through something similar that I don't think I would have had if I had an A score of 0.
Mm.
So I wonder about that.
Yeah. Okay. So I do feel like on one level. Okay. Yeah.
Am I taking care of you sufficiently?
Oh,
Like,
yeah.
such a vulnerable thing. Oh my gosh, the locker.
Well, I will also recently, very recently, maybe 2 months ago, I was up, or maybe I'll just save it. Well, whatever, doesn't matter. Just a couple months ago, I was up at the club. As you can imagine, I was. And there was like a group of boys
Mm,
playing in the locker room. And one of the boys, small, like these boys were more like 6, something, 7. One of the boys, they locked him in the locker. And I just went nuts.
yes.
And it was like, I just was like, I mean, I perhaps I'm not sure I overreacted, but of course it obviously struck a very, very personal chord. And I was like, ran over there. I let him out. I said, you boys, I don't know who you are, but you cannot do this. You cannot lock anyone in this locker.
That's right.
I do think that, it is an indication, like you say, that, you know, if your ACE score hadn't been a 6, you probably would not as easily identify someone else's suffering as your own, right? So that as the definition of compassion, right? So to truly identify someone else's suffering as your own suffering. And of course, and not only that, but feel the compelling need to alleviate that suffering.
Yeah.
Um, so, and also to feel other people's joy, like empathic joy, for
Yes.
example. So, in many ways, yes, we can leverage, these inflection points, these experiences in our life for our own, call it spiritual growth. Um, and because we both likely fall into the highly sensitive category, and I have a daughter that does too. I see the work that she does in the world. She works once a week with kids on the spectrum, on the autism spectrum, and because she sees some of herself in them. So, we can transmute some of these experiences into superpowers. I think that's the good news. That's the hope. I think the pitfall, the trickiness along the way is not to get sick ourselves.
Yes.
So like when you say freeze or fawn, I think about fawn all the time. Think about, okay, I mean, even in the context of that one experience, I was like, the rest of the year, I was sort of like trying to impress people and shake it off and seem tough and blow it off and, just to try to win curry favor in other people's eyes,
Yeah.
as if their judgment of me was the ultimate arbiter of my self-worth.
But it also makes me wonder, when you feel into this horrible thing that happened in 7th grade, is there a way that it resonates with some epigenetic change that you've inherited? Like, is it bigger? I mean, it's big enough, that trauma that you experienced, but you don't know about, a similar experience of torture in your history.
Yeah, it's certainly possible. I mean, I started to get into Rachel Yehuda's work,
Yeah.
and I know you mentioned her in the book, and essentially how acquired traits and behaviors can be passed down transgenerationally. So if there, I know she studied the 9/11 victims, but also famously like the Holocaust families in I think Cleveland, somewhere in Ohio.
Mhm.
And she was testing them and they had this high prevalence of PTSD. And then they're like the P1, the progeny, first generation progeny, even though they grew up in sort of like middle class Cleveland, they also had the symptoms of PTSD, very much highly prevalent among the women, and then the same cortisol profiles. And at first it was actually, I couldn't get my head around it because they were actually chronically low
Yes.
cortisol levels.
Yes.
And I was
She
like,
she couldn't get her head around it either.
yeah, but then it seems like because of the dysregulated stress response and the high cortisol production for a certain period of time, the receptor sort of dysregulated such
Yes.
that then there was this like inverse reaction in terms of the adrenal creation of cortisol, which ended up leading to these very like low cortisol states, which have their own sets of issues,
That's
right?
right.
So
That's
it
right.
was, uh,
Yeah, she found this first with Vietnam veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder, and it was a head scratcher, and she was like, I would expect to find high cortisol. Why am I seeing low cortisol?
right.
And she found it, as you described, in families that survived the Holocaust and looking at offspring. and also in those that survived 9/11 and the women that were pregnant in 9/11 and looking at their babies. And so it does seem to be a dysregulated system, that there's this period of high cortisol followed by a period of low cortisol. And part of what's interesting to me as a scientist is that it's actually the low cortisol state,
Hmm.
kind of the flat diurnal pattern,
Right.
that is the most immune dysregulating.
Mm.
Like, that's the worst out of all of them,
Hmm.
more so than high cortisol.
Right, because cortisol is an immunosuppressant, really, right? So, I mean, you can get cortisone shots or whatever as an immunosuppressant when you have overactive inflammation, right? So it would seem to follow, and of course, this is a very layman's understanding here, but that a low cortisol may lead to a lack of immunosuppressants, so essentially like an overactive immune response. Um,
And that's the pattern we see. So
yeah.
people with autoimmune disease tend to have low cortisol patterns, low diurnal
Mm,
patterns, low cortisol awakening response.
mm,
We also see that in anxiety. We see it in post traumatic stress disorder, as I mentioned. So there's a constellation of symptoms, kind of what's important there, what's happening to the larger immune system is
mhm,
less understood. But when you look at the enzyme that converts cortisol to cortisone, and that's like 11 beta HSD, something like that. Um, that's one of the enzymes that becomes dysregulated by exposure to trauma.
hmm,
And it's not just the work of Rachel Yehuda. There's another
yeah.
really interesting study, and I can't remember if we've talked about it before. It's called Project Ice Storm.
Oh, is this in Montreal? That one?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
I did read about that. It's not Rachel Yehuda, but it's another fascinating study.
It's a fascinating
Yeah.
study. So it's the study of this terrible ice storm that went through Canada, where people were um, they were isolated in their homes for about 2 weeks. No
Mhm.
heat, no power, and they looked at the women who were pregnant. This happened, I think, around 1998 or something
Yeah.
like that.
Right.
So now the offspring of the women who were pregnant are in their 20s. And what they found is that the genes that got changed in terms of epigenetic changes, so these are like little paper clips that get put on the DNA. The genes that got changed were in two classes: metabolism and immune function.
Mm,
Those are the two that got changed by this traumatic experience. And so it makes sense when
yeah.
you look at things like autoimmunity, when you look at the risk of type 2 diabetes and metabolic dysfunction, it makes sense that trauma is changing the expression of those genes.
Hey, thanks a lot for watching. If you enjoyed this video, then I think you'll love this one too.